Well, now that you pitched all your institutes, which is really, of course, an appreciation, and I actually should not take up too much of time also here to lead a discussion, because I also assume that many of you have questions. But I think some of the topics that certainly are of interest is, when we look at your institutes, they're having quite different functions. So we have, of course, language education, which is the basis for area studies. If you don't have the language, you cannot really pursue it. Versus then you have an institution outside of Japan, versus 3 institutions that are on site, which brings it back to my initial question about, you know, what does the future bring us about place? How much does it matter? Where are the shifts? Where are the trends going? And what are also the changes? We've seen that you have institutional or governmental support. You have funding. You seem all to be very well alive and kicking. There seems to be not really a problem that you need to worry about your finances for next year. Your budget seems to be in place. This is wonderful. So perhaps a report like the one by Ithaca does not really matter as much, or does it? So that will be one of my questions. You know, what are the expectations institutionally to your institutes? Now, taking off the PR part, but, you know, thinking, you know, what are the expectations in the long run? Many of you are more recent directors, right? You came in, and what are the expectations for the next generations? Because this is one of the things we try to achieve with today's symposium, to really think about what will happen in 10, 15, 20 years, to selfishly, you know, tell me what to do with the journal, that I can see now the trends and where we're going. You know, is area studies really a dead animal in 10 years, or is it still alive? Then, of course, yes, we are guilty also about language, right? I am German and certainly not too comfortable in English for myself. And Monumenta started off by being multilingual, right? And it was only in the 60s that they switched over to English, making it its main language. So, yes, my French is really poor, so it's fine that we speak here in English. Japanese would have been, of course, the other option, but since the journal is right now an English publication, it seems only appropriate also to have that. But anyway, so maybe you just, if anyone would just try to get started in the discussion, that would be wonderful. And we also welcome, of course, questions from you, our community here, to address us. Anyone?
So, you know, regarding the future of area studies, I think in my own institution, there is a bit of tension between the university's priorities and the faculty's priorities. So, the best sort of example of this, we have an organization on campus called UChicago Global, which was created at the presidential and provostial levels without much faculty input, and this UChicago Global decided to create a series of centers around the university. So we have one in Beijing, one in Hong Kong, one in Delhi, and one in France. But you'll notice not one in Japan. And we were initially told, well, Beijing is actually an East Asia center, but not really. And I think that, so, yeah, I think the interest of the university is very much toward what they see as growing and significant sort of economic centers and contemporary issues, whereas our center is much more sort of focused on humanities, on history and literature across time, and so on. So, yeah, it's sometimes a bit disconcerting to find that however much we talk about the need to have a new position in Japanese studies or Korean studies to bring us, you know, a little closer to parity with the number of Chinese studies faculty, the upper administration is not really speaking to that. And so I think that's one of the kind of concerns that we have, is how to keep East Asian studies not becoming Chinese studies with just a little bit of representation from other countries in the region.
If I speak personally, I left Germany after my master's to pursue a PhD in the US because I did not feel that I was getting enough methodological training in Japanese studies in Germany at the time. And so that's why I enrolled then in sociology to get that training. And, at the University of Hawaii, of course, with Japan scholars, Japan specialists. But I still find that an inherent problem that if you are just trying to get your methodological training on the side, that you're always trying to catch up, particularly to US scholars who come with very strong methodological skills and to compete on a global scale and to be part of the academic discourse if you're lagging behind in that. So I think that is still an inherent problem. We were talking before that you were saying Chinese studies, or China is getting so strong in the East Asian studies, and we don't see that. I mean, the last 5 years I was in Vienna, at the University of Vienna, it's also Japanese studies is part of this Department of East Asian Studies, and whenever you talk to people from the outside, they're saying, oh yeah, China must be getting so strong, with China, thinking about Chinese economy, but the enrollment is rather low. We continue to see a boom in new students wanting to enroll in Japanese studies. The reason is different. During my time, it was sports, right? Karate and judo fans that became interested in Japan. Now it is Japan's soft power, right? It's popular culture, it's manga, anime, and but I think to service those interests, maybe is if you don't have that. Well, that's also a question. Do you want to service those interests and start hiring new faculty that is then teaching on popular culture, on media, or do you want to incorporate those interests, or do you just continue doing your thing in terms of content? And we see some students that are more interested in the language learning part, so that would be for but then the academic interest in researching Japan, sometimes is lagging, to talk very generalizing. But Japanese studies and I believe that's the case in Germany too, is not seeing a decline as yet.
I would just add that this French situation is similar to the German situation or Austrian situation. I mean that, of course, the Chinese problematic is present, but for different reasons, which would be a little bit long to explain here. Japanese studies are still quite strong, and there are about 5,000 to 6,000 learning students in France in all the universities. I must also precise that for the language policies, that we are all, public servants. You know that French universities are public universities. So when we come here, we are not on our individual pace, we are on the public space like that. So we have also a kind of government policies in the defense of the language. That could be a difference between the countries because as you know, France has a kind of tradition and history about that. But of course, in the same time, of course, English is really rising as the only communication language nowadays. And for a lot of researches, and especially, of course, as you know, in sciences, but also in human social sciences, especially in economy or linguistics, for example, everybody nowadays uses only English. So this is a kind of between Chinese, Japanese on one side, and English and other languages on the other side. We have a kind of very important, I think, arena of discussion here, which is very important. I would like to ask, maybe to introduce also another question, which would be the digital turn, the electronic turn, and all the things which come together with. That means the transformation of our knowledge and approaching of the knowledge, especially for the young generations. I mean, how do our students read the things and appropriate the knowledge? We see that in the everyday life, and I think that the second problem also, which is tackling the problem of languages.
I'm not sure where the discussion is going or how to come. But, there was some talk about popular culture, and I guess I would like to build on that. Although the funding situation for my institute and the others is fairly stable right now, in a sense, it's a coincidence, I think, or it's not something you can necessarily count on in the future. It depends on continued interest in Japan, Japanese studies, area studies. I'm not sure how far to go back historically, but back when I first started studying Japanese language in the it was the 1970s. At the time, people in the language classes I was in were interested in, I think a lot of them were interested in Eastern religions because of counterculture in the United States, particularly the West Coast at that time. And then there were others who were simply interested in Japanese gardens or theater or literature or something very traditional. And as you all know, when Japan became very strong economically, particularly in the bubble years, I was not at the center at that time, but I was in Japan at that time teaching, and the students we got were all interested in learning Japanese for utilitarian purposes. They wanted to go out and make money in the real world in finance or something else. And then, broadly speaking, the shift has been towards interest in popular culture, so that if you talk to students now on undergraduate exchanges or at the Inter-University Center or young scholars, I ask them, and all of them say, 95% of them say that they played games or they watched anime or read manga, and that's not necessarily what they're doing now. Well, we teach them language, but they're learning language because they want to go on to academia or in some cases business. So they're studying things that in many cases are not so different than what was the case 20 or 30 years ago. At least they're in the same disciplines, as I said, but how they got into it differs. So I must say that I hope that Japan's popular culture remains robust for the long term in order to support all of our efforts.
Okay. So I would like to talk about pop culture and young scholars. So I specialize Japanese mythology. So I have a class for foreign students. So many students interested in pop culture and mythology or Shinto. But so I feel that my institution is Japanese culture and classics. So many young scholars wanted to know about current manga, anime, but they don't want to learn about Japanese classics, so classic language. So I feel that the scholar decrease to the scholar who can read Japanese classics will be decrease. So I feel about that situation.
Well, and I think that is a very valid point. I mean, like the institutes represented by France and the one by Germany too is really showing, it's more about contemporary issues and problems and topics concerning Japan versus perhaps, some, like your concern is also connected still to the past and the history. So we do see that. And I also saw, of course, the the history of our institutions, our academic institutions, are quite different from whether you are in North America or you are in some of the European countries where we do have, like I was trained in Japanology with a second major in history, so I got my discipline, but if, of course, I mean, many might only major in Japanese studies, and so the trainings, I guess the way we come out of our academic degrees, the path might already be quite different. That's why also maybe the perception of that area studies is very valid and very meaningful in Europe might be quite different to some institutions in the US where you have very subtle disciplines and something like Japanese history would be a side thing to do. In some of them, large institution like yours, of course, in Chicago, is again quite different, where you offer so much more in that, but smaller institutions might be different. But we should also, of course, open it up here to the audience at last. I'm sorry to keep you out of that discussion. Please, do you have any questions there? Yes, Linda. And please introduce yourself.
Linda Grove, I'm a professor emerita at Sophia, but my field is not Japanese studies, but Chinese studies. And I now work for the Social Science Research Council office in Tokyo. And I have a couple of comments. One of them is about funding to Susan. And you said, well, the Title VI grant has been renewed. Unless I'm mistaken, this last year the American Congress threatened to end all Title VI grants. And they ended them in some languages, and it's not clear that the funding is going on. So that's the first one. The second one, when I went to the University of California, Berkeley, as a graduate student back in the late 1960s, you could only do an area studies degree to an MA. There were no area studies degrees at the PhD level. And I'm sure that continues to the present day. The other comment has to do with the development of area studies in the US, which was back in the 50s and 60s funded by Ford and with area studies committees that SSRC organized. And those committees were all collapsed, basically, in the late 1980s, early 1990s. That doesn't mean nobody does area studies anymore, but it means that the formal funding and kind of organization around that has moved to something else. So I look, for example, at young scholars in things like sociology or political science or economics. And we think that they need to have area knowledge to study Japan or China or Korea. Their departments don't think so. And the question is what we can do about that, or is there anything we can do about it? In disciplines like mine, history or some of the others, literature, religion, the departments don't doubt that we need to know language and need to know something about the country, but many of the contemporary social sciences don't seem to hold that view. And if you have any ideas or things that are being done to try to get around that.
The point you bring up about the vulnerability of Title VI is a really important one. And I must say, at the University of Chicago, because we're a relatively well-off private institution, we don't use titles, we don't use FLASs, for example, to, we do get them, but our graduate students would continue to be funded even if we lost the FLASs. But of course, at many state universities, graduate student funding for people in Japanese studies or graduate students comes through FLAS money, which is government money coming through the Department of Education. So it really is, I think, a crisis if this money was to dry up. And we, last year, before we heard that the Title VI would survive, we're really wondering what would happen, because we do use it to fund part of our Korean language program and one of our Japanese lecturers. So it's quite crucial to us. And I imagine for state universities, it would be a real crisis if they were to lose the Title VI and the FLAS. So what's going to happen in the next couple of years? Everybody was saying that the Trump administration is so disorganized, they couldn't get themselves organized to cancel things. And hopefully that will continue to be the case. But I do think the other point I'd like to make is this question about the social sciences, because we no longer have anybody who works primarily on Japan in either sociology or political science. We were able to get somebody hired an anthropologist because we, the Japan committee, agreed to fully fund the position through 7 years, so through tenure, and if the person was tenured by anthropology, they would then pick it up. And we have tried to strike similar agreements with political science and sociology in order to have somebody, and they weren't willing to undertake a search, even with this kind of, quite generous financial underpinnings. And I think that just speaks to the way they define their positions. They don't think language training, deep immersion in a culture is really necessary. And they think, I think in many cases, that a successful person is one who kind of, moves around different countries, testing different methodologies or with a different sense of problem. So I think that's a really big issue.
Yes, there's one in the back. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. Manuela Hartwig, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Tsukuba. I would like to know what do you do and what do you propose, or in what way is it possible to integrate the teaching of research skills and more professional skills into area studies? I think you already kind of dipped into it with some of your comments, because I ask this because I can very much relate to what Barbara Holte said. Why leaving Germany after the master's, because I did my undergraduate and graduate studies at the Free University of Berlin, and I left Germany for the very same reason, is that I did not get research skills or teaching in it at all, in a degree that I could do what I wanted to do for my master's. So I would like to know more about what do you think should be done, what can be done, because I realize it's difficult to get professorship from different areas, interior studies, and to make this connection. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I wish we'd have a solution to that. To a certain degree, now let me speak again from my experience the last 5 years teaching at Vienna University, and the faculty there is trying to pick up the slack of teaching. For example, we're teaching quantitative methods, introduction, because a lot of the students that are interested in doing some form of sociological research, right, on Japan for their masters, then find themselves greatly at odds to how do I deal with data, and if they haven't been picking up any other side, and in Vienna it is you have your major and that's it, and so if they haven't ventured out, it's us as faculty to try to pick that up, to see the demand of the students, and to teach that. But you can only go that far. But it's such a structural problem I see, that it's usually, go off and find yourself, go to take sociology classes and enroll there and as your minor and do that. And I totally understand it's frustrating, and you want, you're someone who's, teaching you the content as well as that you can have methodological and research skill talks with that, mentor that you have. So, but these are larger structural problems, and I don't see that that's solvable right now the way things are, and how Europe is doing this Bologna thing, and I'm rather critical of how the BA was implemented too. So there's a lot of, and I wouldn't know. I'm sorry, I'm at odds at solving it.
Maybe I can add information for France for this question, which is a real question. I must say that when very good students in mastering in Japanese studies come to us and tell us that they would like to continue go on with a PhD, we ask them if they have another formation, theoretical disciplinary formation, which for us is absolutely necessary. So in fact, we ask a lot to our students. They need to have a double formation. It's not in the text, but in fact, if they don't do that, they cannot succeed in good PhD for us. You know, in France, PhD thesis have 500 pages, more or less. It's a very high level work, and it's not possible if you are just mastering in Japanese studies. So I don't know for the other countries, but they work a lot of students to be able to achieve their project.
I can't really add much, but that's certainly true. I mean, it's true in the United States as well. I think probably with everybody else in this room, I think that area studies is very important. I've devoted my career to Japanese studies, but language training is essential, and also disciplinary knowledge and methodology, I think, is essential, and that's why people train in disciplines. There was a student at the center this year who I was talking to, who was in, there are some apparently Japanese studies PhD programs in some major universities in the United States now, and the student was in one of those, but was transferring out and entering another discipline-based program at another school in the same state, and I asked him why, and he said, well, if I get a PhD in Japanese studies, I'll never get a job in the US. And I don't know if that's true, but I can see where he was going.
You know, I actually find it quite interesting that there's so much criticism about area studies, you know, this kind of interdisciplinary thing, because at my university, the popular majors are all these new interdisciplinary majors like global studies, environmental studies. There's a whole host of these things. Urban studies is another one. You know, which are also these things where you're basically taking classes drawn from all different departments, and I'm occasionally asked to, you know, serve as an advisor for a student writing a BA essay. And it's very hard because they have a certain kind of knowledge, but they have no disciplinary framework. And so I think it's so interesting that at the moment when there is this critique going on in the US about area studies, you know, the students are quite interested in interdisciplinary things, but I do think it's quite hard to pull off. And I actually tell students, you know, you must have a discipline before you can be interdisciplinary. So you may want to, you know, be in a disciplinary department and do this thing. That's the best of both worlds. And I think that's also true for area studies.
Carl Friday at Saitama University. This, I guess, is more of a comment maybe than a question per se, but I kind of like to get if the panelists have any strategizing suggestions. But one of the things that I've found on this problem with what we're talking about here, where you find that balance between discipline and area studies, in terms of program building, I'm finding that it's very difficult to sell administrations on that there has to be some of both. You know, I think the atmosphere at the moment, at least in Japan, is very, very good for area studies. But on the other hand, I'm just lost, or I'm in the process of losing a big battle at my university. Zero interest in, okay, but if you want to have a real program, then you have to have at least 2 people doing a field. You can't have a solid master's program with one historian and somebody who does manga and then somebody who does economics. And you know, how do you put that together? I mean, do you have any suggestions for how you build programs that way? It seems to me, you know, that you can build. I used to go through this in the States as well. You know, the sort of risk model where you try to cover as many different parts of the board as you can, or you build like Othello, where you're trying to, which has always been my preference. You move out. One of my colleagues used to talk about three-legged stools. How do you convince people of that balance?
Carl, I don't really have a good answer to that. Probably nobody does there. One model that I know you're familiar with, also at a national university, is at Kyushu University. There's a master's program taught in English. They sold it because their school needs to globalize. They're one of the recipients of the Super Global Program, Type A grants, and that was how they got the money that's coming up with it. And, that particular program seems to be pretty good because it's pretty tightly focused on early pre-modern Japan, specifically history and art history, and so they're able to incorporate both methodological classes, courses, work, and other things. But beyond that, I don't. So maybe other panelists here. That's just a comment.
We do have people who can talk about that more. Here, yes, please.
Theodore Cook, Ted Cook, William Patterson University, and thanks to Bettina, I'm here for the next several months as a fellow, research fellow. But this is very grateful for this panel. Hopefully we'll have a chance to talk to I hope we'll have a chance to talk to several of you afterwards. I'm delighted about the Kogakuin University program. I want to go visit that program. But what I was thinking of, one of the things you raised very early on was place. The idea of place. And one of the things that a university like my own was a state university, a small, about 10,000 students. It's a reasonably small university. One of the things that we were responsible for is essentially bringing Asia to the community. I mean, when they want to set up a new program, when they wanted to create our Japanese language teaching program or our Japanese or South Asia program, they immediately say, oh, there are a lot of South Asians live in this area. Well, that's not the purpose of an Asian studies program, is to educate the South Asians about South Asia or something. There are lots of Indians here. But that was a standard part of the conversation, and we fought it. I just left 10 years as the Asian Studies director, and so it's bigger than even East Asia. I've just left that job to go on sabbatical. And I'm delighted to find, I was struck that we had a great responsibility, though, for educating the school teachers in the region, in the area, and we staged an annual Teach Asia conference for the school teachers until the state of New Jersey cut off all the funding for teachers to go to their conferences, or to go take a day off. They had to pay their own replacement. Well, that pretty much killed the program. But for 6 years, we had that, a regular feature of that. One of them was to showcase our undergraduates to teachers coming in so they might convince their students in high school that Asia, something they might want to study elsewhere. And we called it taking Asia with you when you go. So you have some Asia with you when you graduated. We're not trying to turn scholars out at that level, but if someone really got interested in Asia, they could go on and begin to expand their activities. So going back to place, it's clear that the differences here, the wonderful differences of France, we've been interested, Haruko and Tayako and I have been interested in trying to find ways to get to Europe and back to expand our own interests, because we believe that it's vital to look at things in an interdisciplinary and internationally diverse way, because the field we've been working on is oral history, or I've been working in military history, and Carl might even join into that we often had interdisciplinary concepts in our own fields. I went as an historian, so I went to the program at Inter-University Center when we were still here in Tokyo, and it was Kojimachi, a long time ago. But it was vital to me. But when Marius Jensen sent me, he said, if you do really well, we'll pay for it. That was a pretty big incentive for a student with no money 1 year into Princeton graduate program. But at that time, I knew sort of what I wanted to do if I ever got the language to do it. So the fact that we now have to convince students that language is important is frightening, really. It's disturbing, but it's also something which in this universal world, like the internet world, they can get it right on the screen anytime they want it. And so it becomes more, just my idea of how you think about this, as institutes focusing on the place that you're located and the places you're coming from and the places we want to send people to. The concept of place has many, many dimensions. And I am personally concerned that we won't, that area studies is a place you can sort of add to or begin at your own fields if you, so as an undergraduate or as even a pre-undergraduate. As I said, we're trying to sell students to take Japanese freshman year. And we have a freshman year requirement at my university for languages, but most of the departments opt out of it. They have you do it later on. Well, so people coming in with 2 years of Chinese will not take Chinese freshman year, and then they don't never take it again because they got tired of it. Anyway, enough of my commentaries. Thank you. But I really was appreciative of the way in which we look at these issues. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Yes. Hmm? Oh.
Hi, my name is Yoshi Takayamamoto. I teach Japanese literature at Osaka University. I had a question about the issue of what language to write academic books and papers in, which Professor Sakai mentioned. And I wanted to ask the panel, how viable would it be to use both English and Japanese in Japanese studies? Because I think only using English would exclude a lot of Japanese-speaking scholars. But at the same time, it's very important to use English to open up Japanese studies to people who are unfamiliar with Japanese. And so I'm always kind of trying to grapple with this myself. But how viable would it be to use both Japanese and English? Because supposedly all Japanese specialists would be able to understand Japanese, but not all Japanese-speaking Japanese scholars would be able to understand English. And so I wanted to ask your thoughts.
I think it is, I mean, again, I'm speaking personally and from, the researchers that we have at the Institute. For us, it is easier to write academic articles in English than in Japanese. Ideally, I fully agree. If you want to be really noticed by Japanese academia in your field, you should be publishing articles, of course, also in Japanese. It is just a bigger hurdle, maybe I'm just speaking about myself, to write well in Japanese an academic article than it is to write in English. As well as, okay, so it's again a question of where you want to head to. If you are, and I think that it should be, and that's of course an idea, to communicate with the researchers in Japan. You're working on Japan, of course you should be communicating with the Japanese researchers. Yeah? And you do that through your academic articles. And if if you're writing in English, you're not as well, recognized and cannot really facilitate the academic exchange you wish for, you should be writing in Japanese. It's just a bigger hurdle. But if you also have to be thinking about where your job market is, right? If you're still a senior researcher and you still have to think about, where's my next job going to be? And that's why we changed our journal into Japanese too, and that's why all our researchers are now publishing in English almost exclusively, because you're having to think about a global job market. A lot of our researchers are now trying to and actually find jobs within Japan. They are hoping also for jobs within the larger European community, or Australia, or the US is really difficult to enter, but also it has been done. So it's also funding, trying to get your resources, and of course you need help. it's just me and a few others, that you do need help to write a good Japanese language article. But ideally, you do both.
Just a comment. Of course, in principle, you've heard it's often very difficult. It's harder to write in Japanese for us, and also another point is that at a lot of universities in the English-speaking world, faculty are not rewarded well for publishing in foreign languages, so it's to their benefit to publish more in English. On the other side, ideally more Japanese scholars would publish in English, but there's an awful lot of good research that is not disseminated in English, so I think translation is tremendously important. And to make a plug for Monumenta, we're always trying to translate good Japanese research that would not otherwise be seen in English into English.
So I'd like to talk about my case. So I'm a mythologist, a specialized Japanese mythology. So basically, I don't need to talk in English in abroad, but in Japan, mythology is so small academic sphere. So I suppose there are 3 or 5 scholars in Japan. So I have to talk about a universal aspect of Japanese mythology. So I have to talk in English in academic sphere in abroad. So I suppose we have to training about English presentation. So in spite of Japanese scholars studying Japanese studies, I think.
And I would like, it's a very interesting question, come back to the question of languages. So for example, for Europe, we have, for me, French, Japanese, and English. We have to handle with those 3 languages and have a policy about that. So in your case, in Japan, a lot of our colleagues, scholars, publish in Japan, in Japanese, because of the audience and the academic frontiers we have, and the big challenge that we have all nowadays is if we want to address the global audience in itself, there are no other tools than English. So even including Japanese people nowadays, I think it's a real problem that we have to face really. And for our part, for example, we in Ebisu, in our journal, we translate into French some Japanese papers who would never been known if we did not use the tool of translation. So I'm absolutely in accord with you. I mean, I think that nowadays a key word is translation. We have to educate a lot of translators also, because we cannot ask to everybody to be able to speak in all the many languages. So translation is not only a skill, but of course it's an economical sector, and we need money also to pay the translators. I think that's something important.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting discussion. I think obviously it would be great if more Japanese scholars wrote in European languages, so they'd have a different readership, and if we wrote in Japanese. But I think there is a lot of structural issues. As Bruce suggested, for a young scholar who wants to get tenured in an American university, an article or even a book in Japanese will not be helpful. And a translation, no matter how important the work you're translating is, it won't be helpful. So I think, advising my graduate students, I wouldn't tell them, because I want them to all get tenured and have some degree of economic security. And so I think that is something to think about. I also think that I've had a number of students over the years who've tried to apply for jobs in Japan, and you often see for a beginning level job, and they seem to want to hire a non-Japanese person. They ask for 5 articles, but if you're publishing in good academic journals in the US, it's impossible to have 5 articles. It takes many years, over a year or more to go through the review process. And so I think there are structural issues on both sides, right, that sort of govern sort of moving between academic cultures and scholarly exchanges in particular languages.
There is one. Okay, that will be then the final. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, there are 2 more, and then we will have Fleon pose it.
Hello, my name is Elaine Riggs. I'm a professional translator. Originally, a few years ago, I was managing editor at Monumenta. And of course, I'm very excited about this anniversary. And congratulations to all the people who did all the work. I have been a translator for about 40 years, and my original background was out of area studies at the University of Hawaii. And at the time I was doing graduate work, I wanted to be a professor. I thought I wanted to be a scholar. And so because I love studying, it turned out that I wasn't really destined to do PhD work, and I happened into a career as a translator. I am now extremely grateful for this area studies background that I received, and I believe that one very important area for area studies is to give people who have an affinity for translation the academic background that is very important to be a professional translator of serious and academic work. Anything that's written for books or serious journal articles. It's a very difficult field that requires long years of experience, and it does require an academic background to really get ahead. So I have always hoped that graduate programs would recognize the importance of the profession of translation. Many of my most talented colleagues as translators of academic books are people who actually were doing PhD programs. Some of them actually dropped out and then became translators, and they are among the most reliable in the field. So I would like to ask area studies people to consider the possibility of training people who would go on for professional translation. And I would make a point that it is totally different from translation studies as a discipline. Thank you.
Hi. Yes. In 2010, my university. Oh, I should introduce myself. But I'm sorry. My name is Tonomura, and I work at the University of Michigan. In 2010, at the University of Michigan, there's a institution called International Institute. It has many area studies within it, and they held a rather large conference called Relevant Obsolete ? Rethinking Area Studies in the U.S. Academy. So at that time, it was a rather large conference, and it went on for 3 or 4 days. And what was interesting there was that, so Japan is an area of studies, but then all the other, even West Europe is an area of studies. So that puts all these different regions in the world on equal platform. And then you begin to think in what ways and at what point in global transformation since 1930s, which area studies became more important than others. And in the case of Japan, of course, as the enemy of the US, it was very prominent, especially at University of Michigan after the war, during the war and after the war. One thing that was interesting was West Europe has been suffering a lot. It hasn't had any really crucial issues that they can stand out. And although as West European studies by itself produces a lot of interesting things, and there are many scholars, but nonetheless, in the global scale of things, it really hasn't been so interesting as opposed to some other places which are more issue-oriented and more interesting. Like it fits into the concerns about, let's say, immigration or global inequalities or environmental issues and so on and so on. So some other places are more interesting. So in that sense, then, we can think about area studies in a more global and long-term. And then if Japan becomes an enemy of the USA, then it would be better maybe for area studies, perhaps. But right now it's not. And so Japan looks so civilized and peaceful and all. So what is there to talk about? Whereas China, is both an enemy and friend, and so it's more complicated. So it has gets a lot of attention. So in thinking about area studies in general, it's sometimes interesting to think about other area studies and what they are doing and how we can kind of integrate with them as an area studies on the campus, on the university campus, and work with them and then stand out on our own.
Thank you. You made it at the end still into some sort of a positive thing. And in particular, if you consider Sophia University being in Japan, where we have Japanese studies and many other area studies, where again, place matters really. It's quite different probably to an American institution where you would have area studies. Because I mean, this shift, this geopolitical shift of area studies, focusing on different parts of the world is certainly one of the main issues. So I'm not so quite sure if we offer the next generation any good advice. I feel there was lots of negative vibes going through this room, but we still have coffee break now, and then we move on to a new type of interdisciplinary research and results of what we can do to move on into the future. But thank you very much, everyone here, to be there.